Some of you may know I've been ordained for about 50 years, and during my 50 years, several times I served as the vocation director. And early on, I was stationed here at Enders Island as the vocation director, and I remember we were getting all kinds of candidates, and some of them didn't know much about their religious foundation of faith. So I decided as vocation director I was going to ask them a basic question. What's the significance of Easter? Now, the first guy that I was interviewing was from one of the local community colleges, and I said, what's the significance of Easter? And he said, that's when Santa Claus comes and we get a lot of gifts. I said, oh God, we can't accept you. The second guy, he was from one of the state universities, a pretty prominent one, and I thought, well, this guy will know something. What's the significance of Easter? And he said, that's when we get Valentine's and we get our mom some candy. Well, at least it's dealing with love. So we didn't accept him either. But the third guy, he was from a Catholic college. I think it was St. Michael's, the one that the Edmondites founded. And I said, what's the significance of Easter? That's when Jesus comes out of the tomb, but if he sees his shadow. I told that in England, they don't have Groundhog's Day, and they all looked at me. I begin with that because part of today's readings all deal with calling people who were deeply flawed. And I remember over my 50 years, one of the guys that was an Edmondite who's long dead, a little short priest by the name of Bill LePage. Bill LePage was stationed for many years in our Edmondite missions. And Bill said to me as a young priest, he said, don't ever take credit when things are going well, because God is accomplishing that. And he said, don't ever get discouraged when things are going badly. Why? Because God has to work with human beings. And always remember that. Of all the things that Bill said, that was the most practical advice he could have given to me as a young priest. In any case, I think those two stories, I hope, introduce today's readings in a way that helps us think about who God calls. God operates, if you think about it, a very perverse employment agency that you could imagine. He selects very unlikely candidates, ordinary people, to do extraordinary things. He picks Abraham and Sarah. Sarah's infertile, to be the parents of nations. He picks Isaac, who's a liar, to be the guardian of God's truth. He picks Joseph. He entrusts Joseph, who's arrogant and dreamy and always fighting, getting on the bad side of his siblings, to save a starving people. He picks Moses, who was a murderer, to be the lawgiver and the liberator of slaves. He picks David, who's a small boy who kills a giant, to be not only a great military leader, but we see, despite him being covetous and scheming and murderous adulterer, he becomes the benchmark for great kings of Israel. He calls Paul, who is initially the enemy of the gospel, to be the great apostle to the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And God calls quarreling, vacillating fishermen to leave their nets in today's gospel to fish for souls. My point is, over and over again, God picks ordinary people like you and me that by any standard of common sense we would be ruled out as being the least effective for the work to be done. And the point that I hope you'll take and ponder this week is, if God could use them, he certainly can use you and me. God delights in doing extraordinary things with ordinary people who are deeply flawed oftentimes. And it's important to notice how the transformation takes place. In just about every situation, What happens is God transforms these individuals as they take up God's work. And doing God's work transforms Simon, for example, who is vacillating, into Peter, the rock on which the church is built. He takes Saul, who was persecuting the Christian people and an agent of death, to be the great evangelizer of a new way of life and a new way. If you're like most Christians, when you think of the saints, you only think about the end of their life and their sainthood. And you fail to realize that these individuals were oftentimes deeply flawed. And some spiritual writers refer to that as kind of the stained glass syndrome. We have a tendency to only remember the good things about our saints. And we forget how they were as individuals before they got taken up into God's life and action. Not only do many people get used by God who have faults and weaknesses, but they often have faults and weaknesses that would seem to disqualify them. Disqualify them for the unique purpose that God uses them. And God's power, Paul will make mention of in a number of his letters. He makes the point that God's power is made manifest in our weakness. I don't know about you, but every time I think about my weaknesses, I get kind of squeamish. I don't like thinking about them. But Paul's point is, it's precisely in our weaknesses that God works a transforming way. And if God can use them, God can use you and me. In a world, if you would do great things, we have a number of our folks here in residence who, as they complete their stay, go on to get good jobs and things like that. One of the things people look for when you're looking to be hired is the person competent? Is there anything in their record that shows some flaws? What kind of faults did they have? Those are all things that our society and our culture look at when they're hiring folks. Or at least those things seem to be very important, and we try our best to look our best when we go for a job interview. And some of us are pretty good at fooling employers that we are extremely competent, that we have no flaws, and we're absolutely faultless. My father was perfect. At least he tried to convince my mother that, who knew otherwise. But that was supposed to be humorous, and you didn't laugh. To maintain ourselves at that level, my point would be, is ludicrous, because none of us can ever really be that perfect. And human beings are routinely broken by trying to wear that mask of being perfect. And God really, I think we need to think about this. God is not so much concerned for our ability as our availability. Most of us will use as an excuse that we're not available because we're not having some ability that is required. The question is not whether you and I have an ability, but rather whether we have an availability. God used others in the past not because they were able, at least initially, but because they were available. And if God could use them, God can use you and me. Humility and surrender, not perfection and accomplishment, are the passports of the journey to greatness in God's service. And that's good news, great news for those of us who have tried so hard and so often have failed. In each calling in today's reading, an ordinary, even a weak person answers God's call, because God in some way exhibits some power, some majesty that attracts them. And notice that there is very little to suggest that the individuals are responding because God orders them or commands them. No, they answer God's call because they came to recognize God's signs and wonders, God's unmistaken presence in their lives, a God who touched their world with miracle and mystery. If God can use them, he can use you and me.